Hi, good afternoon to everybody. Sorry I had to walk around all the desks. What I wanted to do for you guys today was just to kind of help you out with supply and demand, getting ready for the test this upcoming week. So I just wanted to go through a few things with you. The first, all right, remember that when we're talking supply and demand and we're talking about actually shifting either supply or demand, that one of the determinants has to change. So we've got our demand determinants, the number of buyers, consumer taste, consumer incomes, substitutes and complements, consumer expectations. Remember, substitutes and complements, substitutes are things that you would freely swap out. So if you really like pizza and you really like hamburgers, you'd eat either one no matter what. Those are substitute goods. Complementary goods are things that we would use together. Milk and cereal, peanut butter and jelly, cream and coffee, things that are generally used together. Those are our demand determinants. If one of those changes, then we can shift our demand curve. All right. Supply determinants. Okay. Supply determinants. Number of producers. Right. How many people are out there actually selling? Factor costs. So these are costs that producers have to pay. So this could be like labor. This could be the cost of raw materials like steel or plastic. The cost of gas. Right. All kinds of things go into factor cost. Producer expectations. What do sellers think is going to happen in the future? Taxes and subsidies. You know, are these producers being taxed? Are they being offered a subsidy by the government? That's going to affect supply. And then also technology. Right? Technology can affect supply as well. So what I want to do is go through a couple of examples with you guys. Okay, so let's start with demand. All right, and so we can see here we have our initial equilibrium. All right, and you can see we've got price on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal, upward sloping supply, downward sloping demand, and we've labeled our initial equilibrium, lowercase p, lowercase q. All right, so let's say that we're looking at, let's say we're looking at the market for pumpkins. All right, it's October. All right, so we're looking at the market for pumpkins. Okay, and let's say that consumers now have a greater desire for pumpkins because it's Halloween time, right? It's October, so consumer tastes would be changing, right? So now we've identified our determinant that would be changing. Then we're going to go ahead and increase demand. I'm just going to put a little D2 there. All right, we're going to increase demand, a rightward shift. Remember, increases are always shifts to the right. So now you can see we've established a new equilibrium. All right, we have a higher equilibrium price and a higher equilibrium quantity. All right, so we see that demand shifts because of that determinant, right? We said consumer taste. But you notice what happens with supply. The supply curve doesn't shift because this isn't a supply determinant that was changing. What you're getting is movement along the supply curve, right? You can see that the quantity supplied is increasing to keep pace with this increased demand for pumpkins. This is a good opportunity for sellers to increase their quantity of pumpkins that they would sell because there's money to be made. All right, so that's one example. All right, one example of a demand determinant. All right, well, let's go through another one. All right, let's go through a potential decrease in demand. All right, so we'll start all over again. And so let's say now that we'll continue, this is the market for pumpkins, but let's say now it's January, right? Fall season has passed. You know, pumpkins really aren't all that desirable anymore. So now you have a situation where maybe the number of buyers decreases, right? Not as many people buying pumpkins in January as there were in October. So you would then see a decrease in demand, all right? And we can see a new equilibrium quantity and a new equilibrium price. That decrease in demand has caused our price to fall and the quantity to decrease as well. For producers now, it makes sense to lower the quantity supplied because the price is lower. They're not going to get as much out of it, right? They're not going to make as much money, okay? So again, when you shift supply, when you shift demand, one of these determinants has to change, okay? One of the determinants has to change in order for you to shift supply or shift demand. All right, so let's take a look on the blank graph over here. Let's talk about supply a little bit. Okay, so we have our supply determinants. All right, and now let's say that, let's continue with pumpkins. All right, And let's say that there's some new fertilizer technology that allows for, more pumpkins to be grown, okay? Well, that's definitely something that's going to affect production, right? It falls under technology. So in that case, increase in supply, right? That increase in supply has increased our quantity, but it's decreased our price. And so you might initially say, well, why would suppliers be willing to supply all these extra pumpkins if the price goes down? Well, that's because there's demand for them. Notice that the quantity demanded increased. So if there's a demand for those pumpkins, okay, then suppliers have an incentive to go ahead and supply more, even at a lower price, because they know they're going to sell them. All right. So even though the price goes down a little bit, there's an incentive for them to increase their supply because they can take advantage of consumers and their demand for pumpkins. All right, so there's one example with supply. We had our determinant that was changing with technology. All right, let's look at another example. All right, so we've got our initial equilibrium. So we'll relabel that initial equilibrium. And now again, let's continue with pumpkins. All right, it is that season. All right, and let's say that gas gets really expensive. Okay, and so the trucks that are delivering pumpkins to the pumpkin patch, right, they have to pay more for gas. That's a factor cost. Okay, so that's going to be more of a cost on the pumpkin patch people. Sorry for my alliteration, and that's going to decrease supply. We have higher factor costs. So now we have a situation where supply decreases, the price rises, and the quantity decreases. Notice quantity demanded decreases. Look at the demand curve. Quantity demanded decreases because of that higher price. Right? Remember, that falls right in line with the law of demand. As price rises, quantity demanded would decrease. Okay? So that's what we're looking at when we talk about shifting supply, shifting demand. One of these determinants has to change, okay, in order for you to shift supply or shift demand. So for the test, the most important thing is to be able to identify a determinant, right? In a question that I ask you, identify a determinant. Does that affect supply? Does that affect demand? And then be able to go from there, right? One last thing to keep in mind is that if it's just the price that's changing, then there's no shift. Price is not a determinant. So there's a little bit of confusion on the quiz about surplus and shortage, or the homework from a couple assignments ago, right? When there's a price floor or a price ceiling established, all you're doing is changing the price. You're not actually changing a determinant. So there's no shifting that happens in that particular instance. It's just the price that's changing. So when the price changes, there's movement along the curve. Okay, there's movement along either the supply curve or the demand curve. All right, we can actually see that here. In this particular instance where we were shifting supply, we know a supply determinant changed. That allowed us to shift supply. That decrease in supply raised the price, and the quantity demanded reacted accordingly. It reacted to that change in price. So that decrease in supply that was caused by one of these changes in determinants increased the price and then decreases the quantity demanded. That's kind of the step-by-step process of how it actually works. So hopefully that helps you guys out. I'm going to post this on Google Classroom here in just a minute, all right, and take a look. And again, hopefully it helps you out for the test next week.